the heart of Austin, Texas, a homeless old man sat silently at a bus station bench for years, ignored, overlooked, forgotten. But when a mysterious suitcase triggered a federal investigation and an FBI agent finally asked for his name, the nation was reminded of who he truly was. This is the story of George Hamilton, veteran, ghost operative, and a hero hidden in plain sight. George Hamilton sat on the same cracked bench every morning at the Austin Greyhound station. Weathered by years and softened by silence, the 68-year-old man blended into the backdrop of vending machines, cigarette smoke, and tired travelers. To most, he was just another homeless face, quiet, harmless, forgettable. He wore the same coat every day, army green, faded, patched along the elbows. On colder mornings, he layered up with an old scarf, its frayed ends tucked under the collar. He wasn't dirty, just worn, like a page too often turned. In his lap, balanced delicately on his knees, was always the same thing, a black leather-bound notebook. Its corners were bent. The spine was stitched crudely with fishing line. He wrote in it every day, carefully, deliberately, as if each letter meant something only he could understand. Some employees at the station called him Doc, though no one knew why. A security guard once asked what he was writing. George looked up, smiled faintly, and said, "A memory bank," in case someone ever asks who I was. But no one ever asked. The bus station was a mix of chaos and routine. People passed through on their way to somewhere else. No one lingered, except George. He wasn't waiting for a bus. He was waiting for something else. Perhaps a sign. Perhaps an ending. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, a beat-up Samsonite suitcase was left near the row of lockers across from where George sat. No one noticed it at first. People came and went. An hour passed, then two. A janitor spotted it and alerted security. The security team did a basic sweep, but something felt off. The bag looked deliberately placed, not accidentally forgotten. Protocol was triggered. They cleared the immediate area, pulled yellow tape across benches, and called in the police. George, still seated nearby, was asked to move. He stood without a word, tucked his notebook into his coat, and stepped aside. But someone noticed the way he looked at the suitcase. Not with fear, not with curiosity, but recognition. "You seen this before?" a young officer asked him. George didn't answer. Another officer radioed in, describing the suitcase and its position. Possibly suspicious package, stationary for over 2 hours. Request bomb squad response. Advise federal coordination. The FBI's local field office responded within the hour. A pair of agents arrived, one seasoned, the other young, and by the book. They moved with quiet urgency, their jackets flapping in the cold wind as they scanned the scene. The older agent, Special Agent Roy Beckett, paused when he saw George standing off to the side, surrounded by police tape, watching the chaos unfold with strangely calm eyes. "Who's that?" Beckett asked a nearby officer. "Just a local homeless guy. Name's George, I think. Regular here." "Has he been questioned?" "Not really. He was just sitting nearby." Beckett approached. There was something in the way George held himself. Rigid posture, slight limp, eyes that missed nothing. It was too familiar. "Sir," Beckett said cautiously. "Mind if I ask your name?" George looked up slowly. "That depends," he replied. "On what?" "On whether you want the name I used or the one I was given." Beckett narrowed his eyes. That wasn't an ordinary answer. "Your name, please," he repeated. George exhaled. "Hamilton, George, Lieutenant Commander, retired." It hit Beckett like a thunderclap. He stared at the man, then back at the suitcase, then again at George. The name stirred something, an old declassified file, a mission brief from a decade ago. Beckett pulled out his phone and stepped away. Run the name George Hamilton through Gulf-era Black Ops and Recon Intel. Clearance Tier 2. Now. Back at headquarters, the results came fast, and they came heavy. Lieutenant Commander George Hamilton, former Naval Intelligence, Gulf War operative, codenamed Sentinel, known for intercepting and stopping a bioweapons shipment meant to be released in Riyadh. Commendations classified. Status: discharged. Location: unknown since 2001. Beckett returned to George with something new in his voice: reverence. "We're going to need you to come with us," he said. George didn't flinch. "Am I being detained?" "No," Beckett said softly. "You're being remembered." George didn't speak as the agents led him into a dark, windowless room 2 floors beneath the Austin FBI field office. His boots scraped softly against the linoleum floor. He looked neither anxious nor surprised, just tired. Not the kind of tired that came from a long walk or a sleepless night. It was deeper than that, a soul weariness. Agent Beckett pulled out a chair. "Please." George sat slowly, removing his coat and folding it neatly beside him, as if still following military decorum. His notebook remained in his hand. Across from him, Beckett placed a slim manila file on the table. It had been pulled hastily, half of it redacted, and the rest barely legible from years of photocopies. At the top, Hamilton, George A. Tier 2, Chandi, Naval Intelligence Command, Chiru, Operation Desert Mirage. "I've read your file," Beckett said. "Then you know I don't belong in a cell," George replied. "You're not in a cell," Beckett said quietly. "You're in a place that should have welcomed you back 20 years ago." The young agent who had accompanied Beckett earlier, Special Agent Ramirez, hovered by the door, uncertain. She hadn't known men like George existed outside of fiction, ghosts from wars fought before she was born, soldiers who vanished into silence because they were never meant to be seen in the first place. "We've confirmed your identity," Beckett said. "You stopped a biochemical attack in 1991, saved thousands of lives, and then disappeared." George leaned back. Disappearing was the order. "And after that?" "I followed orders. I faded." Beckett swallowed. The guilt crept in. "Your VA benefits were terminated in 2002. No next of kin listed, no address, no contact." George didn't respond. "Why not reach out?" Ramirez asked gently. George finally looked at her. His eyes were worn but sharp. "Who do you reach out to when no one remembers who you were?" There was a silence. Beckett nodded slowly, then opened the file and slid a photograph across the table. It was grainy, satellite surveillance, a convoy, an explosion, chaos. "That's you pulling a fellow agent out of a burning vehicle," Beckett said. "The agent you saved? He was my instructor at Quantico. Told me once that a man named Ghost Hamilton dragged him 50 yards with a bullet in his leg." George smiled faintly. "He screamed like a kid the whole way." Beckett chuckled despite himself. "You're a legend in some circles." George shook his head. "Legends are for men who come home whole." The weight of those words hung in the room. Ramirez, moved beyond words, sat down quietly across from him. "We found no record of you applying for benefits, pensions, or housing," she said. "No contact with the VA since 2003. George opened his notebook and flipped to a worn page. It was a list of names, places, numbers, all handwritten. One stood out: Carla Hamilton, D. 1997. "My wife passed before we even got to start over," he said, tapping the name softly. "After that, I didn't have the energy to chase paperwork. I'd seen too much of what red tape does in the field." Beckett nodded solemnly. "We've started filing the paperwork to restore your benefits, and we're recommending a formal review, congressional, if needed." George looked at him. "I don't need medals. I just want to stop freezing at night." Ramirez stood. "We can do better than that." They offered him a ride back to the station, but George declined. Instead, Beckett walked him out personally. On the way, George stopped just outside the doors. "Why now?" he asked. Beckett hesitated. "Because someone finally saw you and cared enough to ask your name." George nodded slowly. "Sometimes. That's all it takes." That night, back at the station, George returned to his bench. But something had changed. The janitor who used to avoid him now handed him a cup of hot coffee. The ticket clerk, who never made eye contact, waved at him and said, "Welcome back, sir." And somewhere behind tinted glass and closed doors, agents were rewriting files, correcting decades of silence with overdue recognition. But George? He just opened his notebook and began to write again. This time, the words weren't for memory. They were for the future. 3 days after the incident at the bus station, George Hamilton received a letter delivered by hand, not to a mailbox, but directly to his bench. It was stamped with the seal of the Department of Defense. Inside was an invitation. "You are hereby requested to attend a recognition ceremony at the Pentagon, honoring your service and contribution to national security. Full travel arrangements have been made. A representative will meet you at 0900 hours, Friday." No RSVP was needed. No fine print, just his name, typed in bold at the top. George A. Hamilton, Lieutenant Commander, Retjans, U.S. Naval Intelligence. He stared at the paper for a long while. For years, no one had called him Commander. For decades, no one had remembered at all. At 8:57 a.m. Friday, a black government SUV pulled up to the station. The driver stepped out, opened the door, and saluted. "Sir, I'm here on behalf of the Department of Defense." George blinked. "You're early." The driver smiled. Only seemed right. The ride was quiet, the city slipping away in the rearview mirror. George clutched his notebook like it was armor. His clothes had been replaced by a clean civilian suit provided by a local veterans nonprofit. The shoes were polished, the tie unfamiliar. He looked down at himself like he was staring at someone else's reflection. But when they arrived at the airfield and the private jet with the Department of Defense insignia taxied into view, a piece of the old George, Commander Hamilton, snapped back into place. At Joint Base Andrews, a uniformed Marine escorted him to a secure car, and together they drove to the Pentagon. There were no camera flashes, no press, just reverent silence. Those who recognized him saluted. Those who didn't moved aside out of instinct. Inside the ceremony room, a small crowd had gathered, high-ranking officers, select members of the press, and a group of veterans. The Secretary of the Navy stood near the podium, flipping through index cards. George remained still. His eyes scanned the faces, unfamiliar and yet somehow connected. He wasn't used to this kind of attention. His work had always happened in the shadows. Beckett was there, too. He gave George a small nod of reassurance. At exactly 1100 hours, the room hushed. The secretary stepped forward and began to speak. "Today we honor not just a man, but a mission, a moment, and a memory that this country almost forgot." He recounted George's service record. 3 classified operations during the Gulf War. The interception of a biochemical device in a Riyadh warehouse. Extraction under fire. Silent heroism. We are here today not to rewrite history, but to correct it. Then came the moment. A Navy officer stepped forward carrying a small dark blue velvet box. He opened it to reveal the Defense Distinguished Service Medal, the highest non-combat award a member of the military can receive. George didn't move at first. Then, slowly, he stepped forward. The medal was pinned to his chest with solemn ceremony. For a man once forgotten, the room now stood in silent respect. Not applause, not cheering, just reverence. As the room was dismissed, a woman approached George, her hands trembling. "My brother," she whispered, "was in that convoy you pulled out in 91. He didn't make it, but your report, your actions, we read about it after his death. My family always wondered what happened to you. We thought maybe you died too." George looked her in the eyes. "I did, for a while." She cried as she hugged him. Later that afternoon, George was taken to a modest one-bedroom apartment in Arlington, part of a veterans' housing initiative. The furniture was new, the fridge stocked. There was even a welcome note on the table. "You're home now, Commander." VHA Team. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, uncertain whether to enter. This wasn't a bench. This wasn't a cot in a shelter. This was permanent. Inside, on the wall, someone had already mounted a small frame, his newly issued military ID, alongside a printed quote. "The nation which forgets its defenders will itself be forgotten." Calvin Coolidge. George chuckled softly. Someone's got a sense of irony. He placed his notebook down on the kitchen table, pulled out a pen, and flipped to a fresh page. He wrote just 4 words. "They remembered me today." The following weeks passed quietly, but not without meaning. George Hamilton's life no longer revolved around coin cups and worn benches. His mornings began with fresh coffee, brewed on his own stovetop. He fed the small bird that nested outside his window and read the news with cautious eyes. A nurse visited weekly. A caseworker helped him re-register for his long-lost benefits. It was all new, yet oddly familiar, like muscle memory returning after years of disuse. But not all the changes were material. One morning, George was invited to speak at a high school assembly in Alexandria. The principal, a Gulf War veteran himself, had heard George's story and asked him to talk to students about integrity, resilience, and service. George almost said no. He hated the spotlight, but something deeper compelled him to go. He stood before 500 teenagers, hands trembling slightly at the mic, a copy of his old notebook in his coat pocket. "I'm not here to inspire you," he began, voice low and steady. "I'm here to remind you that what you do for others when no one's watching matters. That service doesn't end with a uniform, and that some battles never make the news, but they still leave scars." Silence filled the auditorium. Every eye locked on him. He paused. "And when the world forgets you, don't forget who you are." They gave him a standing ovation. After the assembly, a shy student approached and handed him a folded note. Inside, scrawled in ink, "I want to serve too, like you. Thank you for not disappearing forever." George folded it into his notebook. Weeks turned to months. His story had quietly gone viral. News outlets picked it up. Military networks shared it. A small independent filmmaker even asked permission to turn his life into a short documentary. George declined. "Let the story speak. It doesn't need a face." But something unexpected happened. A growing number of forgotten veterans across the country began reaching out to veteran services, emboldened by George's story. His experience became the catalyst for a policy review at the Department of Veterans Affairs. One congressman even held up George's dog tags on the House floor, declaring, "If one of our best could be forgotten this long, how many more are slipping through the cracks?" It was a moment George never saw, but one built from his silence. One crisp spring morning, George returned to Austin. He didn't go back to the station bench, not at first. Instead, he walked its perimeter, quiet, deliberate, as if retracing the outlines of his former life. He passed the row of lockers, the broken vending machine, the janitor with the mop, who now nodded at him with quiet respect. And then he sat, on his bench, just once more. A young man joined him moments later, thin, jittery, wearing a too-big hoodie, the kind of face George had seen 100 times. "You the vet?" the kid asked. "The one the FBI picked up?" George raised an eyebrow. "Maybe. You running from 'em?" The kid smiled, then dropped the act. "Nah, just got nowhere to go." George nodded slowly. "Sit. Tell me what you're running toward." For hours they talked, about war, about pain, about starting over. George didn't give advice. He just listened, like someone once should have done for him. When the sun began to set, George reached into his notebook and tore out a page. On it, he wrote the name of a contact at the Veterans Legal Network. "Give this to a man named Dunham," he said. "He helped me stand up again. He'll help you too." The kid took it, eyes damp. "Thanks. For real?" George stood. "Don't thank me. Just make sure you're not the one sitting here 40 years from now. As he walked away, he didn't look back. He didn't need to. George Hamilton was never seeking recognition. He wasn't chasing medals, headlines, or applause. He simply wanted to be remembered as a man who served, who endured, and who finally came home. And in doing so, he lit a quiet flame for every forgotten hero still out there, still waiting for someone to ask, "What's your name?" If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell to honor forgotten heroes like George. Comment below with "Never Forgotten" to stand with those who served in silence. Share this video because someone out there still believes they've been forgotten. Let's remind them they're not alone. This is Unsung Valor Stories, where hidden heroes are finally heard.